to today's webinar on radical humility as a topic and volume, edited by Rebekah Modrak and Jamie Vander, both of who are on the call with us today. So happy that you're here joining us. I wanted to thank the Public Philosophy Journal, the Department of Religious Studies, African American and African Studies at Michigan State College of Arts and Letters for co-sponsoring this event, and all the panelists for their important and significant contributions. Also, Michelle Danai and Shelby Brewster for all of their help publicizing and coordinating things. I'm Gretel Van Wieren, professor in the Department of Religious Studies and affiliate in philosophy at Michigan State University. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about the impetus for this project, and then also about the format for our webinar, which I expect will last about an hour. So thank you again for joining us. So I first learned about radical humility, the volume and the term, which I love, from my colleague and friend Ruth Nicole Brown, who mentioned it to me in a conversation and then was gracious enough to have the publisher, Belt Publishing, email me a copy. And I loved the book right from the start for its incredibly diverse treatment of the idea of humility, which has such long traction in my particular field of study, religious studies and philosophy, in terms of thinking about humility as a practice and an idea. And also for just how boundary pushing it was in so many ways to raise issues that were so important for the societal issues that were going on. So I thought it would be perfect for the Public Philosophy Journal in terms of engaging in a publicly facing interdisciplinary way, and so approached Chris Long and managing editor Kurt Milberger, who graciously and thankfully thought it was a good idea too. And so the project was born. Ruth Nicole Brown had these fabulous ideas for interlocutors, all of whom amazingly agreed, which I'm so thankful for too. And so the essays in this project, the panelists are here, each of whom contributed an essay. And so the online link to the actual piece that will appear in the Public Philosophy Journal will be posted in the chat for you to link to that broader project and read really the beautiful and profound essays. I was so moved by the essays in terms of how they engaged the topic from both a personal and scholarly way from the particular author's disciplinary and experiential backgrounds. Very unique, I think, in terms of scholarship and terms of just the permission and the space to really engage a broader range of sources, including our personal experiences, for thinking about critical social issues. So in terms of the format, each of the panelists, each of the authors is going to take about 5 minutes to introduce themselves and just say really whatever they would like about the essay they contributed or something else about the project, really whatever inspired or moved them. And then if participants could post questions or answers or specific things for panelists in the Q&A, hopefully we'll have time at the end to engage some of those questions. Otherwise, we will open it up just for dialogue among panelists and response that way. So thank you again so much for participating, and the authors and the PPJ and just everything that has gone into this the past year. I am thrilled for how it came together and so grateful for the contributions and that you are all here. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Kurt Milberger at the PPJ to say something about that platform, which is amazing, and I would encourage you to check it out. as a place to do some of your work, because it's just a really, really incredible space for, I think, cutting edge scholarship and publicly engaged research. So I will turn it over to Kurt and the PPJ team.
Thanks, Gretel. Hello to everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Kurt Milberger. I serve as the managing editor of the Public Philosophy Journal, and I won't take up a ton of time here. I just wanted to make a couple of remarks about the coming together of the forum and the work that everyone did to it. First of all, I wanted to say thanks to Gretel and thanks to everyone who contributed to the project. It was a real genuine joy to work with you all and to see this come together, to see how things developed in your work together, and to watch it now culminate here in this roundtable is super exciting. And I'm really excited to be a part of sharing this work with the world and being a part of this event today. For folks who are unfamiliar with the Public Philosophy Journal, it's an experiment in open access digitally native publishing that seeks to do scholarship with the public for whom that work is intended. This means putting folks in touch with people outside of their fields, in touch with each other, and trying to reimagine how scholarship is done. By working on changing the way that we do peer review and thinking of it as a formative process where people are engaging with other folks that they haven't maybe worked with, we're trying to break down barriers between researchers and the publics that they're trying to address. And we're also trying to make visible the hard work of reviewing and engagement that goes into producing scholarship. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts about the forum for me, is that you can really see where people are working with each other, where they're thinking with each other. And we've documented the ways that their engagements have changed their contributions to the forum and helped turn it into what it is today. So I'm really excited to share that with you and to model this way of doing scholarship differently that we're trying to encourage with the Public Philosophy Journal. One of the journal's core values is what our editor-in-chief, Chris Long, calls thick collegiality, which I note in thinking about radical humility, that the two kind of go hand in hand. But thick collegiality is this attempt to offer an alternative to the rivalry and combat and gatekeeping that can characterize academic publishing. And I think we see a really wonderful example of that happening in the forum, where folks are working to refine each other's work in meaningful ways. And I really do hope that you'll enjoy it as much as we did working on it. Before I get out of the way here, I wanted to add a couple of more thanks to the chorus of thanks that are happening at the outset today. First of all, to Gretel and to all of the contributors, thank you all so much for your work, for trusting us with your work, and for engaging so openly in the process. It means a lot to see these ideas that we formulate with the PPJ team actually being put into practice and having them work for people. That's a really exciting part of this work for me. I also want to thank the PPJ team, Shelby Brewster, Phil Paulino, and Nick Catone, who helped to in various ways to review and edit and publish this forum. And as Gretel said, and Shelby linked in the chat, you can now read the forum online where you can explore the various entries there. I wanted to share my screen just really quickly to put in a pitch. We're publishing in a digital platform called Manifold that allows you to make an account. It's not no purchasing, but you can make an account where you can do annotations and discuss the piece with people via the platform, so the interaction can continue after the roundtable ends today. So I encourage you to check that out and register for the site and read and annotate and discuss the pieces that you see there. So that's about it for me. I'll turn it over to Rebekah and Jamie to talk about the Radical Humility book project. And thanks to you all again for joining us today and for contributing to the forum.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurt. So I'm Rebekah Modrak. I'm an artist and a professor in the art school at the University of Michigan, and one of the editors of Radical Humility, along with Jamie Vander Broek. And it's just an honor to be here today with this remarkable group of scholars. We're really grateful to the Public Philosophy Journal for extending the conversations that started in the book and even before the book during one weekend here at the campus of University of Michigan. The seed for the book started with observations of a university that was unable to acknowledge failure and more invested in show than substance. And after a particularly hard year of this, I went one summer to a small town in Nebraska to interview farmers. They told me that the best farmer was one who was the most humble, the one that was most willing to adapt. And of course, the people who told me this did not consider themselves to be the best farmer. But humility was not a word that ever came up in my 13 years here at the university. But the farmers regularly demonstrated a practice related to what Ruth Nicole Brown calls you before me. They put others first in conversation. They knew that nature and mechanical failure were far more powerful forces than their own egos. And as one of our authors, Jen Wright Cole, has written, they didn't center themselves as the gravitational force. So Jamie and I put Radical Humility's collection of essays and collection of authors together to try to understand humility through lived experiences. We wanted to understand humility as a choice in real contexts rather than theoretical ones. So the essays live in places like Troy Jolly Moore's classroom, or a hospital room with Amy Walsh or Rick Boothman, in a kitchen with Kevin M. and 10 other cooks, at Tyler Denmead's football game, in the soil as described by Kevin Hamilton, and especially in Ruth Nicole's Aunt Dottie's house, which inspired many of the reflections here today. And I'm gonna turn it over to Jamie Vander Broek.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Vander Broek. I'm a librarian for art and design at the University of Michigan and Rebekah's colleague and co-editor of Radical Humility. I want to start off by acknowledging my own background and privilege as a white cisgendered woman working in academia. My co-editor shares these aspects of my identity, and together, we in particular found our identity as women quite salient when reviewing the contributions, or many of them, to this project. In other ways, however, we took on the role of keenly interested colleagues, but nevertheless outsiders to other identities and experiences in the world. All of this together influenced our responses to the writings. We saw many references to give and take. In other words, Ruth Nicole Brown and her Aunt Dottie's you before me method of being in the world, and how that selflessness turned outwards towards the small and the less important, and putting it first has shown up for others in their personal and professional lives. One of the most interesting conversations that the essays generated for us, from my perspective, was about Socrates and whether he can be considered the worst offender of arrogance after all, peppering others with questions instead of truly listening or working to understand them. This conversation stemmed from reading Nimot's essay, and for me, also from reading Agnes Collard and Troy Jollimer's essays in the book, which both mention the philosopher. For a while, I had been wondering about Socrates and humility, and reading this reflection sort of started this conversation. Does he really put himself first, taking up all the air with his questions rather than exemplifying the you before me ethos? Is the nonstop questioning really a form of not listening at all? Or is he truly the epitome of a generous way of being, asking questions of not only important fellow philosophers, but instead seeing all people as having thoughts in their heads that would be valuable to draw out into the conversation in the world? Certainly, we endeavor to live in a give and take way in our personal and professional lives, to take seriously the thoughts of beginners and to use our roles to create spaces for others. Indeed, so many of the essays described elder figures who supported and paved a way for the writers, a role that is not always celebrated within our academic context, particularly when this person comes from a domestic or a personal realm and isn't part of the traditional system of training in higher education. The essays called on us to value things that are small, highlighting the central lesson of our book, that importance is really an illusion, and that each of us is small, and that it is worth shutting out all the noise and the bombast of the world to focus on that idea and what it can mean for our lives, and especially how we relate to others. So I thank you so much for putting this together, all of you, and especially to Ruth Nicole Brown. I have been changed by reading your work, and I use the things that you put into the essay in my daily life all the time. And I feel really honored to be among all of you. And I am looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Rebekah and Jamie. So next we have Todd Shaw.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for this invitation to this conversation, as well as this invitation to be a part of this dialogue about the Radical Humility volume, which was intriguing in a lot of ways, particularly coming from my standpoint of political science, where political science and African American studies, but in the discipline of political science, I don't know if we study humility. I'll just leave that there for a moment for reflection. But again, like many, I'm also very grateful for having the honor that Ruth Nicole refers to me as one of her teachers, because I've learned more from her than she has from me. And so thank you for your continued friendship and collegiality, Ruth Nicole. My essay was entitled Put on No Airs. The radical humility examples of Brown and Blow. And in this essay, I try to draw a bridge between the thinking and the wonderful essay by Ruth Nicole on her Aunt Dottie, and in all the ways that she exemplified radical humility. In Charles Blow's essays, where he talks about the friendship and the friendship that was filled with tension but insight between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and the way in which, in some ways, Lincoln learned more from Douglass than at first glance, or what might have been first presumed to be the case. So that phrase of "put on no airs" comes from my grandmother, Catherine Stokes Speller, who was a African-American woman born in Virginia. Well, as far as we know, that grandmother was born in Virginia. We're still doing a little bit more research on this because she lived to be 93 years old and passed about 10 years ago. But when I thought about her example, when I read Ruth Nicole's essay, I thought of my own grandmother, who always, whether it be her church pastor or whether it be her grandsons, would always end with the phrase, with the goodbye of "I love you, and by the way, remember to put on no airs." Now, for my grandmother, that meant that you should be authentic. You should tell the truth. You should not be afraid of being grounded. You should be fundamentally grounded, and in fact, never let any title, any accomplishment, anything you do in life get in the way of your humanity and in the way of the humanity of others. And so I won't say that my grandmother and I, with our various discussions, including our political discussions, always agreed, but her life lesson to me, much like as you reflected with Nicole, sort of just continues to ring in my head. And in the way that your Aunt Dottie's garden represents sort of that very important, more than a symbol to you, or more than just sort of flowers. It represents sort of the wealth of lessons that she conveyed, as much through her example as it was through her words. And so I had to think about, well, what was the connection between Ruth Nicole's essay about her Aunt Dottie's radical humility and Charles Blow's suggestion that Lincoln learned from Douglass. And so I'll just say this, and then I'll conclude. Because Brown describes her Aunt Dottie in this way: Aunt Dottie's generosity was sourced with a life-affirming humility that, among other things, works as an antidote to misunderstanding. And I think that life-affirming humility means that we're in connection. We are in partnership. And that humility is an act between individuals, right? And if we don't recognize those connections of how I am in connection with you to understand what it means to be in this, to be equally affirming in what we do, then I think we miss what is actually sort of a key aspect of that radical humility. And so I also just sort of say with Charles Blow's essay, what he said in effect was to speak about Lincoln's humility in saying what he learned from Douglass, because Lincoln's example provides us at least with some insights about how presidents, how individuals who lead the republic should act relative to how at least one of our former presidents acted. and in ways he was not and is not a humble individual. And so I end the essay in this way by saying, so what if Ruth Nicole did not have that example of her Aunt Dottie to gift to us? What if Blow couldn't have drawn upon the example of Lincoln and Douglas, so we can think about what should be that standard for individuals at various capacities of leadership within the Republic? I stated in this way. What if Adani had been able to give a Brown excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm reading, yes, okay. Well, what if Aunt Dottie had been unable to give Brown a garden full of humility lessons? How might Brown, as a distinguished professor, have had a smaller storehouse of role models in working toward the grassroots empowerment of Black girls and Black communities? Because, as I say in this essay, to listen to someone who you disagree with, as was the case with Lincoln and Douglas, to admit that you have been wrong and to have been brave enough to change your mind. In short, Lincoln, Aunt Dottie, my grandmother, Ruth Nicole, are persons who don't put on any airs. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Todd Shaw from University of South Carolina. And now we'll turn to Paulina Camacho Valencia from University of Illinois.
Thank you. I do want to reiterate all of the gratitude again for the invitation to be here today. And I know everyone has said it, but I will say it again. And thank you for the PPJ team for your great work editing and just all the wonderful feedback. I'm Paulina Camacho Valencia. I am a student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I was really moved by the invitation to be here and to share some of my thoughts and insights. And I will admit that I think initially upon the first invitation and upon reading the text, just the book in general, I did have a moment of pause, that the notion of humility and the notion of radicality together left a little bit of a lingering kind of unsettling, right? And I sat with that, I think, for a minute. And I purchased the book before being invited because I was really intrigued by it. And I really enjoyed the way that it amplified my own understanding and notion of what humility can be through this like radical frame. And I think perhaps my hesitation came initially in the way that the notion of humility is often or can be perhaps imposed. And it might be used as a form of subservience or control according to our positionality in the world. And Dr. Brown's essay, I think, offers a counter to that, at least for me. The teachings of Endowed become these examples of gestures and ways of being in the world that I think need to be modeled, and trust in the continued movement and constant change, that we are not beholden to these structures, and that there is a continuation of iterations of this movement, again, through constant change. And so the work that we see through Endowed and through various matrilineal lines often tends to be invisible. It is often not made visible. It is often not made present outside of, again, the gestures. It's often even not spoken about. It just is, and it exists. And so for me, it reminds me of these interdependence, intergenerational dynamics and relationships that have been important and continue to be important for our collective survival, for our need to adapt according to our different life stance and circumstances. There's always this level of support that runs through, especially when, again, these factors or aspects are not always made immediately available or visible. And that this humility can be transformative. Again, it doesn't always have to be spoken into existence, but that in just the gestures, in the act, in the holding of each other, of one another, that there is a transformative power that comes through these acts of humility, care, and service. But we need to be attuned to the right frequency to absorb and reflect on these lessons that are too often, these vibrations or these frequencies are tuned off or are thrown off, but there's a potential to recalibrate. And this reminds me of the tuning of the 8-string jarana right before a fandango, right? And the jarana, with its 5 sizes and varieties, each contributing instrument has its own special pitch and depth. If the strumming combines the rhythms of like all of these stringed instruments with a percussive beat, And there's a mirroring between the music played and the zapateado dance, steps echoing the café con pan rhythm on the tarima, right? So the fandango brings together community and everyone has a part to play or not. The strings are often retuned and recalibrated. And if someone is slightly off sync, the ensemble or the collective holds, right, the tune and holds the rhythm while you are able to retune and sweeps you back into the fold. There's no distinction, right, between the roles. You can move between playing the jarana, singing and dancing, serving plates of hot food, or just sitting back and observing, taking in the beauty of the energy and the frequency that is generated by the community. And there's space for everyone. So whether you're an active participant or a watchful observer, you are held, and there's space and ample opportunity to learn to recognize our own strengths in time as needed. And there is never competition with others, but there are contributing factors. You can be part of the band. There's never enough jaranas, right? You can be one of like 12, and it's the way that we all collectively hold the rhythm, hold the music, hold that space for one another. You can, right, participate on a percussive rhythm by tapping on any surface. You can lend your voice to the lyrics. You can make up your own lyrics as you go along. And if perhaps you don't feel comfortable sitting in the limelight or sitting in, in the middle of the performative ensemble, there is space to sit back, to observe, to help an elder make their way to the front row, to play with the children on the sidelines, to hold conversation. But that we are all allowed this sense of collective holding and collective movement, and the importance again of these like interrelational dynamics where again the humility is modeled. It doesn't always have to be spoken, and that the recalibration can happen in the obvious ways of the physical tuning, but in the subtle and quiet ways of the internal kind of carrying of these frequencies with us that can be applied to other spaces and other moments outside of the fandango. Yeah, and I think the most important thing is allowing ourselves to continue to be moved, and that the importance of these examples need to exist in the world to be able to better point to these gestures that again are often reiteratedly made invisible by their lack of speaking them into existence. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Next, Professor Morgan Shipley, my colleague at MSU.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'll reiterate the same kind of thanks to everyone. On the one hand, thank you, Gretel, for this initial invitation to participate in this forum, and Ruth, Nicole, for an essay that continues to resound consistently in my mind as good work should, but I also think as good teachers should do for us all, right, and to carry us on. I also want to thank the editors for putting together such a great collection. I mean, this book, just to give it a plug, is tremendous. And it's really moving on a host of levels. And for the PPJ team, it was wonderful to work with you all. Like many, I'm Morgan Shipley. I'm the Folio Endowed Chair of Spirituality and the Associate Chair of Undergraduate Studies here at Michigan State University. Like many, I was moved, quite a bit by Ruth, Nicole, and, go to Todd's comments. It brought me right into the space of those who have influenced the way that I think about both myself and my relationship to others. There's a way that I think this collection as a whole kind of propels you out of yourself that humility requires us to do. I think it's Jennifer, there's the essay on escaping the gravitational pull of self, right? And we have to have models for that. And so in my essay that I did for the forum, I talked about my grandma Candy. It's my title, Sweetest Candy. And I shared the anecdote that when I grew up, every Friday before she passed away, she would call me and she'd say Mashugana, which is a Yiddish term meaning crazy one, if we want to have a nice connotation to it. She'd say, Mashugana, what was your mitzvah for the week? And she never was asking me if I followed one of the very specific commandments that's found within Torah, but there's a cultural meaning of mitzvah, which means good deeds. And she always began each conversation with that question. And it took me a while to really realize that what she was asking was, how have I decentered myself to consider others? How do I put others before myself? And as I was thinking about my own kind of brief 5-minute little reflection within the forum that we're doing right now, it propelled me into another space, and that's the influence that I have of my students. And I see quite a few of you in the group that have joined us today, so I want to thank you for joining us. But on a consistent basis, every time I leave each class, my students have enlightened me in some way. They've drawn me out of myself. Part of that is the reverberation of the lessons I know that they're taking away from our class discussions, but it's also how often their honesty and their humility in recognizing what they do not know leads us to think differently about how we can relate to others. And so this week and last week in one of my classes, we're thinking about Buddhism. And the conversation within the forum, the conversation within radical humility, it takes me to this idea found within Buddhism known as pratitya samuppada, which means dependent origination. It's the idea that we do not exist alone, that to exist is to be in a state of coexistence at all times. And I think in a world culture, but especially today in the United States, we're dominated by individual myths and liberal narratives of the self-made individual, the self-made person. To fully understand what this idea means, to live in mutuality, to decenter the self, to exist as you before me, to borrow from Ruth Nicole, is to make a significant move of humility, but a move that's consistently dynamic, that's consistently ongoing, that requires negotiation. And it really means to move away from the self through a recognition that my actions, my choices, my very beingness resounds far beyond myself. It impacts others. And that I do not exist then in isolation, nor can I even function with or even survive without others in my world. And this includes, as Gretel reminds us in her essay, to think always about our natural world too, the environments that surround us. And so the result of humility, I think, is really a commitment to generosity and really an expression of what humble actions are. It doesn't mean simply to recognize what we do not know, but it's also to make that gesture that through our actions, we can empower, we can enliven, we can embolden others. And so I want to thank you all for helping us understand that capacity, for pushing us there, and for offering such beautiful reminders in this current moment we find ourselves in, when we are surrounded by pandemics and war and violence and massive polarization. I think you all guided me back to a deep sense of connection to others. And I'm endlessly moved by that and endlessly thankful for that reminder, not just for myself, but again, for how it resounds beyond me into each one of us. So thank you all. I'm endlessly appreciative.
Thanks so much, Morgan. So next we have Nimot Ogunfemi from University of Illinois.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for briefly introducing me. I'm really happy to be in this space. Again, my name is Nimot Ogunfemi. I'm the daughter of Deborah Randall from the south side of Chicago and the daughter of Adewale Ogunfemi from Abeokuta, Nigeria. And I am me. So I also want to say thank you for allowing me to be in this space and share my thoughts, and also giving me access and exposure to such a really important and timely book. So there's three things I want to talk about. I'm going to look at my time and I'll stop myself when the time reaches when it is. So in reading this and being inspired, first, I want to touch on radical, what it means and what it looks like and how it's necessary. You know, when we think about radical humility, now we're not just talking about humility in an everyday context. In my opinion, when I hear radical humility, that means we're talking about something that disrupts, breaks for the purpose of rebuilding something better, something new. So in order for me to do that, when I think about humility, I also think about the community that's in myself. Dr. Brown said it best when we were students. She said, there's a whole universe within you. So that means my community doesn't begin when I go meet people. It doesn't begin when I leave home. My community, I already can practice that with myself. So when we think about suspending the self or decentering the self, I don't think about removing myself or tossing myself and not being in the space. I don't think it's possible. So to give an example of the community that's in me, there are things that my mind knows that my body does not. And I also believe that there are things that my spirit knows that neither one of them, my mind or my body, could touch. So when that's the case, I think about the way that I need to learn within myself, to pay attention to myself. There's often battles as well around, okay, I feel this. No, that's not true. That's not real. I don't think that's being humility or having radical humility with yourself, which I think is a very important starting point. And that's me trying to complicate this thing. I know it might sound like yourself. How do you start about humility, talking about yourself? I think that's where the radical part comes in. I'm not talking about just everyday humility, I'm talking about radical humility. And I think reading this book helped me think more about that, seeing the multidisciplinary approach and how everybody's coming from their own field with a perspective on that. So now I also talk about radical healing in my profession. I'm a healer by trade. What is going to say on my diploma is counseling psychology, but I'm an African woman, so I'm a healer. And when I'm healing with people, it's more than one person in the room. That's when it's not just me. That's when we start to have two people. And somebody that's considered an expert, and in some case a novice, but at the same time, an expert in their own right. This is what led me to disrupting the power dynamics around teacher and student. I believe that there are things that I allow my 6-year-old nephew to teach me, because there are things that I know nothing about. And there are things that God herself would have to ascend from the center of the earth to tell me that they weren't true, and I still wouldn't believe, because there are things that I know. So I think somewhere in between that is where we can find a radical humility, where we can recognize, beyond, oh, this person doesn't know anything, or I know everything. We all know something. And I think that will help us in this context where it's been mentioned, it's very polarized. And the source of that polarity seems to be, these people are idiots. No, these people are idiots. They don't know anything. They know everything. I don't think that's realistic. And I don't think it's helped us in our current situation, nor will it help us in the future. Oh, am I over? Okay, so I forgot to watch the time. I think I'm gonna stop now so we can have time for questions, but those are my thoughts, and I'm appreciative again for being in the space.
Thank you so much, Nima. Next, we have my colleague at MSU, Professor Beronda Montgomery.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here in community with all of you today, but also to be in community with the other contributors to the published forum. I have to say that when the invitation came, it was in the middle of my having many writing commitments, but it was the invitation from the universe, the very invitation from the universe that I needed, that my soul needed, in the midst of all that's been raging around us for the past 2 years, but also far beyond that. And I am, as I mentioned to some of you, new friends with Ruth Nicole Brown, but I think the depths of respect that I have for her and all the lessons that I've learned from her in the short term that I've known her have a maturity to them. I think it's a maturity that's centered in shared purpose, a maturity that is centered in shared strength, and I hope, at least on my part, in shared humility. And as I was reading this volume, I responded formally to Ruth Nicole Brown's essay, but in reading throughout the book, I was drawn to certain parts because I come to my work in life as a lover of plants, as a professional plant scientist, but also just a lover of plants in my natural life. And so I read things about the ground and soil, but definitely in the essay that was about Ruth Nicole's beloved aunt, I was drawn to her description of her aunt's garden. But she also talked about, Ruth Nicole talked about certain acts of humility representing what she described as negations of self that depended on a complete understanding of generosity divine as trees. And that has just set so deeply with me because trees seem to be simple, but they're also highly complex. And I think that generosity and humility are equally simple, but complex topics that we deal with. And as I was reading through the essay and responding to it, but also reading through other parts of the book, it's really set down in my soul that humility is an invitation, I would think, as well as a powerful form of stewardship. Stewardship over the gifts that we have as humans. Each of us have gifts and skills and expertise that we can offer. We have these in our professional engagements or our personal relationships. And I think that humility is the stewardship we need to use those gifts for their fullest, not just for our own elevation, but to enrich the communities that are within us, like the prior speaker talked about, but the communities that we're deeply embedded in. And I think that was powerfully reflected in the essay by something as simple as you before me sharing a snack. I love snacks, right? And so sharing your snack with the other person first, but also the ways in which throughout all of the relationships that were reflected there, the sharing of generosity, the sharing of material resources, the sharing of our deepest selves. I think that humility is the gift of stewardship that we have to accept to use their gifts for their highest calling. And so really, to me, that's a radical notion, to think of humility not as an act of demonstrating, something about yourself, but a call to stewardship, to protect your gifts and use them in their deepest, most full sense. And so I have been really my own life enriched to think about the ways in which I am endeavoring to use my own humility and to cultivate that humility as a form of stewardship. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be again in communication with you all today.
Thank you so much, Beronda. So our final word from Ruth Nicole Brown, who sparked this whole conversation. So I'll turn it over to my colleague at MSU, Ruth Nicole.
Thank you, Gretel. My name is Ruth Nicole Brown, and I am the chair of African American and African Studies at MSU. Quiet, kind of comprehension, transformed into a gesture, the divine, tender heart, flipping places, impetus for acts are revealed. Humility, I learned first from the adults who meant so much to me in my community. Family, friends, parents, and teachers were audacious with the lessons, even as the teachings were subtle, understated, and not at all concerned with what anyone else thought of the act word gestures of our world making. These first lessons in humility rooted me to home and how to be. Admittedly, as Morgan just mentioned, the relationship between humility and generosity for me in my life and also on the page in the first chapter that I contributed to the Radical Humility volume, as well as my response in our forum, is entangled on the page as it is in practice. And I really can't tell you with enough specificity to satisfy any kind of formulaic expectation where and how one begins and the other ends. For all parts of it, humility was undoubtedly present and is what I know and remember about my Aunt Dottie and Uncle Jack's love, and we levitate's music making practice. It is whole. We make so much with these first lessons learned from those who remain with and in us. To call the names of Catherine Stokes Speller and Grandma Candy is the point and the dot that shapes our wings. And for me, it's really important for me to express my gratitude to you all for being here for so many reasons. Mostly, there are so many different parts of my own life represented on this call that I know for a fact I would not be here now if it weren't for your generosity, instruction, and humility with my own often teaching and learning practice. So what I want to share now is just a bouquet of gratitude. Thank you, Gretel, for the walks and welcoming me to the outdoors as I get to learn this place that I now call home, and your excitement for radical humility, as well as our shared overlapping interest in all things outdoors, raising children, and getting through this work in this life together. It is deeply appreciated. Kurt, your editorship on this forum demonstrated immense care, particularly as a writer who loves the vernacular and my home language. The attentiveness to that is greatly appreciated. When Gretel said, who would you like to be in conversation around extending the work that Rebekah and Jamie began with this book, but I think most importantly, and this, you got to get the book, Radical Humility, Essays on Ordinary Acts. We've celebrated the book in many local bookstores across the US. But for me, holding this book also brings to mind the experience we shared together. It came out of, and I'm still struggling for the word. It was more than a conference. It wasn't a convening. It was something other than an experience, maybe something like a movement. I don't know, but we got together, we laughed. Folks shared their ideas. They were sharp, they were incisive, they were creative, they were critical, they were deeply felt. And we shared meals, we shared space, we shared our doors, we shared time. And all of that comes to mind when I hold this book. And I know these co-authors in a different way from several other volumes that I'm also published in. So just want to extend my gratitude for you all for starting this conversation in this way. And also got to give a shout out to the co-authors in here, Kevin Hamilton and Tyler Denmead, who invited me to the conversation. I had not thought about writing about thinking with humility until they asked and invited me to the work that you all were doing. And I'm pretty sure that they sent that invitation, perhaps because something I shared with them landed like a butterfly near them. And if that's the case, that's only and always because of my Aunt Dottie and Uncle Jack, who I would like you all to know and to remember. They lived in Detroit, 1300 South Deacon Street. And I often made summer visits with them. As a graduate student at the University of Michigan, I was able to share a lot of time with them. And in many ways, due to that sort of thing that I don't know, perhaps logically or in my mind, I'm almost certain that because of their prayers, because of the way they gave, because of the Black that held us all together, because of Hartford Memorial Church in which they were members, they sort of led me back to this particular place and state. And so the same ways that Aunt Dottie sent me off every time in these sort of outgiving rituals, I have known and cherished the ways they have grown me as a person, as a scholar, as a niece, and again, have become very astute, recognizing when that butterfly lands in my own presence in new spaces with people such as Beronda, who, as you mentioned, we had this good year together, and the roots are deep. I'm learning so much over our shared interests in understanding more about everything related to trees, plants, botany, science, as well as the impact of what light can do. And it's an awesome act of humility to be with Beronda and to know that, I just can't get enough of her light. So I'm thankful for that. Dr. Todd Shaw lands as a butterfly that I've seen numerous times since we've known each other for quite a while. I could think of specific instances that each resonate in different ways where he definitely gave a you before me to me so that I may be here now with you all. And I'm gonna put you on blast, Todd, because that's what students who grow up to be professors like to do. But Todd always mentions he's a professor of political science. He is, and he's also one of my most favorite poets as well. A poem gifted to me encouraged me to also put pen to paper in poetic form. I also want to thank Morgan, who just gave us this beautiful instruction and lecture. Morgan, every time you speak, I want to hear more. I want the lecture to continue. I want to be in conversations. I'm always feeling that butterfly land when I'm in the presence of someone who asks questions and I say, I had that same question. And so I'm grateful for your grandma, Candy, and exactly that you called her name in this collection of essays was exactly the point. Nima and Paulina, I'm so glad you said yes. You are among some of my favorite people to think with and to be with. It's not always the case, but it's certainly the case that every time Nimot turned in an assignment, that paper kind of danced, which told me like I need to pay attention to all that Nimot contributes Paulina was among the first to invite me to think in a form that I was completely unfamiliar with, and that is the textile. But when you handed me this hand-stitched heart of the pinky square to represent another you before me relationship in Soul Hot, I felt the butterfly land, and I knew I was in good company. So because of you both, for sure, I know that whatever we call higher education, as it persists today and afterward, is in good hands because it's held by your incredible genius, generosity, and what I recognize to be a radical humility. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all for showing up, for your written essays, and for keeping this really important, I want to call it a conversation, recognizing that it's more than that, but this movement of beauty and collegiality going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, Nicole, and all of you. So we have a few minutes here. Please type your questions in the Q&A. And we'll go here until about 4. Thank you again for being here. So we have a great first question, and I would invite whoever wants to chip in first here. So the question is, with all of the attention being paid to ourselves and to celebrating our humility, how do we keep from becoming like Uriah Heep and Dickens' David Copperfield, so ironically proud of our humility? Which is so in the spirit of this book. So thank you so much for that question. So ironically, how do we keep from being so ironically proud of our humility?
You want someone just to jump in?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
Beronda, thank you.
I think personally, for me, I have to constantly remind myself that humility is not a possession or a destination. Humility for me is a process, a daily process. And I think about it much like I think about the process of writing. So I'm a writer, but there are some days where writing comes easily and I slip into it and the words flow. And there are other days where I sit with the blank page and have to struggle for it. And I think in that sense, humility can be the same thing. And part of the problem is also that in our spaces, we misname ego dressed in a soft fur coat as humility because it feels soft to the touch. And so we have to understand what true humility is, and then to understand that it's not a possession or a destination, but something we have to fight for as a process and walk with every day.
Others. Thank you, Beronda.
I'll just add for exactly 20 seconds. I think that part of what helps my humility practice, as was stated, is the humility circle I draw around me. To me, who are the individuals in my life who are themselves humble examples? And so in some ways, sometimes I can say, well, you know, what would Ruth Nicole do? What would my friend Robert Brown do? In some ways, it reinforces the sense that the individuals I prize the most prize others. And so their practice reinforces my own. And so I think the humility circle helps me.
Thank you, Todd. Others. Morgan, thank you.
I would just say really quickly, I mean, I love what Todd and Beronda both said. I think part of it is trying to stop defining what humility is to think more about what humility does. And I think that shift forces us into that dynamism. It forces us into that circularity. It forces us into that deep ongoing reflection where we never kind of get trapped. And I think that's kind of Nimot, that's the point of that radicality that you were talking about, right? That's what makes it radical. So that's what I would add there. Not so much is, but the does, the action aspect of it. Humility is praxis, we could say.
Mm-hmm. And I really love that point because I also believe it's important to move to the action part. Sometimes when you're moving so much, when you're living, you know, it takes some time before you realize like, oh, that was humility. I was humble in that time. And for me, I'm sure you can get the sense I'm confident and I love being confident. But also humility, it doesn't feel good. Like, I don't think it's anything to brag of in the moment, at least. I know when I was in Tanzania, I didn't speak any Swahili, and it was like 9-year-olds helping me. And in the moment I felt terrible, but then later I was like, okay, those 9-year-olds were teaching me something. That's cool. And so I think it's, just keep moving, you be in the spaces, you be in the community, and later on it might click that you did it, but you got to keep doing it.
Other thoughts on that question in terms of how do we keep from being so proud of our humility?
Well, I'll jump in with an answer that Jennifer Cole gave, which I thought was really beautiful, which is that being humble doesn't necessarily not being affirmative of and affirming the things that you've done, but it means maybe focusing more on the actions and the impact of what you've done and accomplished, rather than it being about yourself and the I. So focusing less on I did this, and more what it was that you did and, how it was connected with other people.
Thank you, Rebekah. Thank you all. So we have another question, and I think we will end on this one since we're reaching 4 o'clock here. But another wonderful question, which reminds me of Rebekah's opening essay in the Radical Humility volume, which I absolutely loved, on plain crackers. But the question is, how do we stay humble in academia when we sit in endowed chairs with endlessly long job titles and have business cards that advertise our degrees? Who'd like to take that one on?
Well, I don't have an endowed title or a long title or any title for that matter yet. But I think for me, I'm constantly reminded of the indigenous decolonial feminist practices of meaning is always made in relation. And so the work, right? The work that we make, the meaning that we make is never in isolation. It is always in response to others, to ideas, to people. And that, I think for me, that is definitely a grounding component and aspect of that this work is never about the self. It is about the work that we're producing with others. It is about the work that Dr. Brown taught me in terms of like honoring and naming those genealogical threads and practices, and really kind of sitting with that and making those multiple ways of knowing and being in the world visible for others, because it's never really about the self. And so how do we get those titles, right? It's not an individual or independent action ever. I don't know.
I would just say I'm sorry, Beronda, did you want to go ahead? I would just say really quickly, I love that idea of relational. And one of the things that I stress to my students is that what matters here is what I call the remainder. It's what carries forward through their actions, through their understandings, through how they then can establish relationships. And it's that dynamic ongoing process. The titles indicate something about where I currently stand, but it says nothing about where that remainder reverberates to. And that's what I like to try to concentrate on.
I was just going to say, I remind myself of what's permanent. And what's permanent is the stewardship that I have over the work, the space, the titles, all of those things are temporary. As I noticed, as soon as I announced I was leaving, there was people are who gets her space, who gets her things, right? Because those are all temporary, the possession of those titles and things. But the stewardship I have over the work and all of that the ancestors and all of my family have invested in me being in this moment to be steward, that's what's permanent. And so I think that's how you remain humble, because all of those things can and will go away. But the thing that remains is what stewardship you have and what you do with that.
Thank you, Beronda. Other thoughts?
I can add real quick. Much like Paulina, I also don't have any of those things yet, but I'm almost there. We're getting there. And I would say those aren't really the things that encouraged me to get a doctoral degree in the first place. I just wanted to have access to articles and books and talk about stuff. So I think that's the part of it that will never change, So I try to remind myself of that my students teach me, the books are still there, there's always opportunities to learn. So I think for me, it's a lifelong process being a student, and that really helps me in this context.
Thank you so much, Nima, and all of you. We will end on that wonderful note that we're so privileged to be able to learn, continue to learn and learn from one another. And it's definitely one theme that I took away from reading all of your essays was the relational aspect of humility that we often think of, at least in Western philosophy, as an individual virtue, but it's so not that. It's a relational practice that we learn with and through others and are constantly learning from other people how to do and how to be generous and kind and loving and justice making. So thank you, all of you, for everything you've taught all of us, and Kurt for the Public Philosophy Journal for having this platform, and Chris Long. So thank you all who participated, and this will be up on the link that's in the chat. Have a great evening, and thanks again to everyone. Thank you.